Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bookish Haven. I am your host, AK, and in this podcast, I will bring you my bookish opinions and intellectual discourse in a fun, interesting, and slightly unhinged way to not only help you pick out your next read, but also to help you discover new facts and ideas about the books you may already have read and loved. And today, we are going to be talking about a very, very special book, classic, one of those books that there's just so much to unpack in this. So I'm talking about none other than Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, the book that I like to say drove me to the brink of madness. So, funnily enough, it was also my first 5-star read of 2024. And I feel like there's just so much to talk about. I remember having finished this book and thinking to myself, like, oh my goodness, what just happened? What have I just read? So, Emily Bronte's Gothic romanticist masterpiece was published firstly in 1847, and since then it has endured through much criticism and compliments as well. It's endured 177 years since. And like I said, it's got its fair share of critics. And one of the key things that I came across in my research, I mean, I shouldn't be surprised, but I kind of was surprised, was that a lot of criticism sort of compares Wuthering Heights to Charlotte Bronte, who is Emily Bronte's sister, to Bronte's Jane Eyre, which firstly is so unfair. If you've got siblings, you know how annoying it can be to not only have yourself compared to them, but to also have your work, your artistic capabilities, your creativity compared to them. So I think it's very unfair. And that's one thing I kind of want to unpack today as well by studying and looking at Wuthering Heights and Emily Bronte's work in its own right, because I think it is such a literary masterpiece. Like, my understanding of it when I first read the book was so superficial and so surface level. And this research has, in a way, allowed me to kind of develop my own ideas further and to think deeply about some of the things that I personally did not think about when I first read the book. So that's what we'll be doing today. I will start off with a synopsis of the book. Now, if you don't like spoilers and you're planning to read the book, feel free to skip forward. However, I will suggest personally that I went into this book knowing what the story was because there's a lot of back and forth going on. It's pretty confusing. So if you don't mind spoilers, I'm not going to spoil anything too interesting. But there will be some spoilers nonetheless. So if that is not your vibe, feel free to skip forward. But if you don't mind, stay along with us. And if you have read the book a while ago, hopefully this will help jog your memory before we get into the real analysis and the real nitty-gritty details of it. So like I said, I'll be starting off with a quick summary and then I'll go on to talk about firstly my own opinions and thoughts and how I felt after reading the book. Then we'll look at some Goodread reviews because those are just amazing. I feel like there is so much on there. Like, I've skimmed through some of them. There was like more than 1 million reviews on Wuthering Heights, by the way. So I couldn't read every single one, but there were some really good measured opinions on there that we'll talk about. And finally, we will come to look at two big questions that I've sort of come across in literature regarding Wuthering Heights. So that's the plan for today. Now let's get started. Essentially, this book, like I said, there's a lot of back and forth going on because most of the story is set in the past and it's a narration of the past. And we then sort of get to see the present and the consequences of what's happened in the past on the present. So, like I said, there is a lot going on. So please, if it gets confusing, I am going to attach some links in the description below so you can check out a written summary if that helps. But I'm going to try my best to keep this as simple and as succinct as possible because otherwise I'll just keep talking and I don't want to spoil the whole book for you. So essentially, a story begins with a tenant, Mr. Lockwood, who comes to live in this property called Thrushcross Grange. Now, this is an isolated sort of area, but there's only one other property nearby, which is called Wuthering Heights. So that's our main setting, Wuthering Heights, and then a nearby manor called Thrushcross Grange. Now, Wuthering Heights in the present is owned by this man named Heathcliff. Heathcliff is living in that he's the owner of the property. And in his house, there is a young woman named Kathy, his daughter-in-law, we find out. There's a servant introduced as Hareton, and there are other two caretakers living in the house. Now, when Mr. Lockwood visits, because, he's new to the neighborhood, there's no one else nearby, and he just wants to, I guess, socialize. So he ends up at Wuthering Heights to meet his new landlord. However, the meeting is very hostile, and because it's snowing, he ends up staying the night. When he stays the night, he's given this little room to live in because all the other rooms are occupied. And in that room at night, he hears knocking on the window. And that knocking belongs to a ghost. Remember, this was written in 1847. It's a Gothic novel, so ghosts are real in this book. So essentially, he wakes up to this knocking, and that knocking belongs to a woman, Catherine. Now, that is referring to Catherine Earnshaw, who was in the past, who used to live in that house. Now, just stay with me here. Anyways, when Mr. Lockwood wakes up, he leaves, he's pretty freaked out by what's happened, and he goes back to Thrushcross Grange. And there he inquires of the servant, whose name is Nellie, as to what is happening over at Wuthering Heights. And he asks about Heathcliff. Who is Heathcliff? Because he's a weirdo. Now, Nellie is a very, very important character. And I kind of want you to, if you have read the book, I want you to kind of reconcile your thoughts about Nellie, because this is something we'll be talking about later as well. But going back to the plot of the book, Nellie then begins a story. She's a narrator, and she has, of course, had the misfortune of knowing Heathcliff, because in the past, I think it's about 30 years ago, she used to live in Wuthering Heights, which was owned by a man called by this man called Mr. Earnshaw. And Mr. Earnshaw had two children. He had a boy named Hindley and a girl named Catherine. Catherine Earnshaw. Now, there are two Catherines here. There's a Catherine in the present, who is a daughter-in-law of Heathcliff, and there's a Catherine in the past. So the two kids are living at Wuthering Heights, and then one day, out of nowhere, Mr. Earnshaw brings home a young boy named Heathcliff. Now, this is main sort of character. So Heathcliff comes to live at Wuthering Heights. We don't actually get to know much about his origin, but he comes to live in Wuthering Heights, and slowly but surely Mr. Earnshaw starts to favor Heathcliff over his own children. And that leads to both the girl and the boy, Hindley and Catherine, to start to sort of, hate Heathcliff and be jealous of him. After a while, though, Catherine becomes friends with Heathcliff, and this is where their love story starts to blossom. Whereas Hindley, who's the boy, he gets very jealous of Heathcliff because of the love that, his father is giving to Heathcliff. And so he starts to abuse and mistreat Heathcliff. After a couple of years, Mr. Earnshaw dies, and when he dies, Hindley is left in charge of Wuthering Heights. He becomes the master. Now, he's a young man, right? He's gone off to university. He comes back. He's married. And when he comes back, he's the master of Wuthering Heights, and he uses that power to abuse and mistreat Heathcliff. And he does that especially in front of Catherine. And that causes Heathcliff to become very vengeful. It hurts his ego. He becomes very bitter, and he vows to take revenge on Hindley one day. So essentially, when Hindley comes back, his wife is pregnant, and he has a son called Hareton. Now, surprise, surprise, in the present, Hareton is working as a servant at Wuthering Heights, which is owned by Heathcliff. So this is happening in the past, where Hindley's come back, he has a child, and he's abusing Heathcliff. So back to the past, one day, after a while, things are not very good in the house, but after a while, Heathcliff hears one day Catherine talking to Nellie, because essentially what happens is that Catherine becomes really good friends with their neighbours who live in Thrushcross Grange, a second property in the present where Mr. Lockwood lives. So she becomes friends with the neighbours Edgar and Isabella Linton. And they're like really fancy, really sophisticated, just really nice people overall. Whereas the same can't be said about, the people living in Wuthering Heights. Anyways, Catherine, because she sort of sees their social status, starts to spend more time over with the Lintons, and especially more time with Edgar Linton. And that makes Heathcliff very jealous because he obviously likes Catherine. And then one day Heathcliff hears Catherine talking to Nellie, who's a housekeeper, also narrator, who's telling us this whole tale. And she tells Nellie basically that Edgar has proposed and that Catherine likes and wants to marry Edgar. Now, this whole scene, I just remember thinking, how foolish was Edgar to do that? But nonetheless, not to digress, coming back. So Yeah, Catherine wants to marry him because he's rich and he's respectable. But when Heathcliff hears this, because this is your typical miscommunication trope, because he's just standing there and she doesn't see him, he's kind of hiding there and listening to this whole conversation. Anyways, Heathcliff hears this first part about, Catherine wanting to marry him because he's rich and he's respectable, all of the things that Heathcliff is not. He hears that and he storms off. However, what he does not hear is then Catherine say that, and I quote this, he, Heathcliff, will never know how I love him. He is more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. So that's, if you've seen that line around, this is where it came from. Anyway, so Heathcliff doesn't hear this whole thing. And so as a result, he's already gone off. Now, a really important detail that I want you to kind of remember right now is that Nellie knew that Heathcliff was hiding there. Nellie knew that he was there, that he was listening to this, but she didn't say anything. And think of that what you will, okay? So anyway, from there begins this really dark, passionate, and this all-consuming story of two people who are so irreconcilable, and yet they're so tangibly, or I guess rather intangibly, they're so drawn together, and that's Heathcliff and Catherine. Catherine then, of course, does go on to marry Edgar, because once Heathcliff hears that whole thing, he actually leaves and goes away for 3 years. And then in that time, Catherine marries Edgar and Heathcliff runs away. And then 3 years later, he comes back. And when he comes back, Catherine is happily married to Edgar, whereas Heathcliff comes back super rich and he takes over as the Lord of Wuthering Heights. How he does that kind of is a bit shady, because at that time, remember Hindley, the boy from earlier, he's living at Wuthering Heights, and Catherine has married Edgar and gone off to live at Thrushcross Grange. So Heathcliff comes back and he somehow takes over at Wuthering Heights, because by this point, Hindley has become very abusive and alcoholic, and he's just not in the right state of mind. And there's a kid growing up there as well, Hareton. So basically Heathcliff takes over. And then when Heathcliff returns, he tries to sort of resume that friendship with Catherine. And what we see is that this really messy display of emotions, and it's a really gray area in my opinion, like the way in which it all happens. Because I mean, if you think of it, it's kind of like cheating, but they don't really do anything, I guess. So it's not quite that, but it's really frustrating, I think, as a reader as well, when you're reading this whole thing, because both Catherine and Heathcliff are so messed up. They're so messed up, and you feel so sorry for Edgar, who, poor guy, I mean, think about it. Like, he lets Heathcliff come back into his house and maintain friendship with Catherine because he loves Catherine. And she was like, you've got to be nice to Heathcliff. And he listens to her. Anyways, now the twist here is, remember how I said that there were 2 kids living in Thrushcross Grange, like there were 2 siblings, Edgar and Isabella. When Heathcliff comes back, somehow these events unfold and essentially he ends up marrying Catherine's sister-in-law, Isabella. This is so messed up. I don't think I've ever felt this sorry for a lot of other book characters that I did for Edgar and Isabella, like these 2 siblings who just ended up with the wrong people and they paid the price for it, especially Isabella, who then obviously in a flurry of passion, she wants to get back at her brother, and especially at Catherine, because in a way, Catherine kind of manipulates her into this whole thing. Catherine actually tells Heathcliff that, hey, Isabella likes you, and she makes fun of Isabella, and so to get back at her, Isabella goes ahead and marries Heathcliff and runs away with him, but she's obviously then abused by him, and it annoys you so much. Like, the number of times I wanted to just throw that book against a wall is unbelievable. Anyways, that's our first generation. This is all happening in the past. That's the chunk of the story, is this narration of the past that I've tried to summarize for you nice and quick. And I say that having taken like, I think 10 minutes to do that. But anyways, so this happened and then they have kids. And this is where we see how one generation starts to pass their trauma onto another, because Catherine and Edgar have a daughter called Catherine. Now that Catherine, I'm going to call her Cathy, because that Cathy ends up marrying, again, not by, to some extent, not by her own choice, but who ends up marrying Heathcliff and Isabella's son, Linton, also her cousin. I remember this is in the 1847s or 1850s, 1800s. So it's kind of like obviously not as frowned upon. But nonetheless, this whole thing that poor Cathy ends up again with Heathcliff's son, Linton. Now, Heathcliff's son, Linton, is a sickly child. Like, that's how he's described. So he actually dies pretty shortly afterwards, and he doesn't want to be married to her either. They're both forced into it by Heathcliff, because Heathcliff, at the end of the day, in the present, he wants revenge on Hindley and on Edgar, and he does so by owning both Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange too, through Cathy and through Linton. That's the reason he got those kids married. And that brings us to the present. So ultimately, this is a very complex novel. And I think sometimes we don't realize that. And I'll talk about this later as well. Like, sometimes we try to simplify it so much, but there's just so much going on. And I would describe it as a tale of passion, right? Of unbridled passion, of love. And it thematically explores so many complex and nuanced ideas, like the idea of nature versus nurture. Looking specifically also at that, how generational trauma passes through generations and how that pattern can be broken. Also, obviously, tackles other important ideas like class, wealth, power. So there's a lot going on. I think that's why this book is beautiful, because even though, and now my opinion of this is that, again, the book is beautiful because even though you hate the characters, like, I don't think I've hated a pair of protagonists more than I've hated Catherine and Heathcliff. Like, they were detestable characters. And I 100% agree. Like, they were manipulative. They were toxic. They were like some of the biggest red flags in literature, those two. And they gaslit each other. Like, it was really, there was nothing redeeming about either of them. Like, there was nothing redeeming at all. But the reason that this book stood out to me is the writing. Like, the writing is so, so beautiful. My personal experience, in fact, like a personal anecdote that I have of Wuthering Heights, is that I'd always kind of been hesitant to read it. Like, I bought the copy because I sort of found out at a sale, and I'm one of those sort of book hoarders that I just got, and I was like, I'm going to read at one point. But I'd been hesitant to read it because a couple of years ago, my English teacher, we were talking about it, and she's like, one of my favorite books is Wuthering Heights. I was like, oh, it's on my reading list. How did you find it? And she goes, I read it after a bad breakup, and it kind of became like a book that helped her process it. She's like, it was a pretty, dark time. And I remember thinking, ooh, okay, so maybe I'll just hold up. I'm probably not like mature enough to read it now. And having read it now, I can definitely see as to why that could be the case. And it must have been, I mean, she's a lovely, lovely lady. Yeah, it must have been probably pretty bad breakup, because this book was just, just such a mad book. That's how I would describe it. Like, if there was one word that I would use to describe this book, is madness. So that's like my personal little anecdote that I always think of fondly. But nonetheless, like I said, the reason the book stands out to me, the reason it was a 5-star rating, I mean, first sort of say 100, 150 pages, like, it can't be more than a 3.5, because these people are so terrible. But then it was just the writing. And I think anytime there was like any dialogues, especially between Catherine and Heathcliff, or there was like any confessions, like, that writing was just absolutely beautiful. Like, can you imagine, like, one of the biggest red flags in literature, Heathcliff, of course, saying something like, only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. It is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. Like, that is so poetic. It is so poetic, and it is just so beautiful. And it kind of takes away from the fact that this dude is so messed up. So I loved the writing. That's how I would describe it. And that's why I want to talk about this book, because there's so much. Like, I mean, again, I know, I'm just saying I love the writing, but there is so much happening in that writing that we kind of take for granted, or that I personally, again, took for granted when I first read it. So, like I said, I found Bronte's writing to be so passionate and emotional. And the thing was, like I said, I hated the characters, but I was invested in the story. I was invested in their love story because, the biggest reason was that I think they truly deserved each other. Like, they were, their souls were made of the same thing, because they were so messed up, both of them. In that way, it's like they were both, their souls are indeed made of one another, because they're both equally messed up, both equally detestable. And the second reason was that just Bronte's writing won me over. It was so, so beautiful. So that's my sort of summary of it, and my opinion and, perception of the book so far. Now let's have a look at what people have to say. So let's have a look at what other readers like myself and yourself have to say. I headed over to Goodreads to have a look at what the opinion is. So here are some stats firstly. There was almost like 2 million ratings, like just under, and there were 67,000 reviews. Sorry, I've got my glasses on, but I still can't read. So the average rating for the book was 3.89 stars, which is fair. I think that's a pretty fair number. If you have a look at the breakdown of it, so 36% of the people gave it a 5 star, 31% gave it 4 star, 20% gave it 3 star, 7% gave it 2 stars, and then 3% gave it 1 star. So let's start off with some reviews. I've just picked like one or two out of a one, like 5 star and a 1 star review, because I think, yeah, some of them are really interesting. Now, what I'll do is I will attach links to this review. So if you want to read the entire review, you can do so. And some of them are really long and really elaborate. So I'm just going to take out excerpts and talk about the things that start to me. But yeah, feel free to check out those links and, research it a bit more if you're interested. So this first review that was on Goodreads, this was a 5 star, and this was just written so eloquently. So this is by Chai, who goes by The Library on TikTok. That's their username. And they said, I'm just on fire with so much admiration for Emily Bronte right now. Heathcliff's vehemence, his grief and naked want, Catherine's selfishness, her strain and struggle, against the confines of her life, these things are rendered so honestly and so rawly in a way that appeal to me, despite sometimes because of their deep, abiding wrongness. Wuthering Heights is not just a story about a toxic romantic attachment between two deeply broken and detestable characters. In fact, to argue the degree to which Heathcliff and Catherine's relationship was toxic or problematic seems less relevant to me than the incontrovertible fact that in a world that would not let them be whole, Catherine and Heathcliff lent meaning to each other. Like, it was so beautifully written. And the thing that stood out to me was their argument that problematic relationship that they have, but about the meaning that they provided to one another, because that's just what their character was. I think that was really interesting, and they expressed it really beautiful. So that's a 5 star review. Now, 1 star reviews. I think 1 star reviews are always so much fun to read because they challenge your opinion, like they challenge your understanding. So our first 1 star review is from Ellen. So Ellen says the layer of perspective make it annoying and sometimes impossible to figure out who is telling what bit of the story. Moreover, because so much is related as two characters explaining things between themselves, the result is that we rarely see any action, and instead of the entire book explained in a Socratic pedantic exposition. And she continued, the most damning thing is that the characters are a bunch of immature, insufferable, narcissistic beep with very little self-respect. This isn't a story of great love and passion. It's the story of how child abuse perpetuates itself through the generations. Now, I think this was a very, very measured opinion by Ellen, and I would agree to most of it. I think the thing that I probably would I agree with it, but I can sort of find an argument against it, is this idea that the characters are a bunch of immature, insufferable, narcissistic beeps. I don't know how to edit the beep over it, so I'm just gonna say it, but there's like a swear word there. And yeah, I think that's very interesting because I can definitely see that, and I would have had the same opinion when I first read it. But I do think that to a huge extent, that plays into the complexity of the characters that Bronte has created. Like, these are not simple people. They are immature, they are insufferable, but at the same time, like, there was depth, I think, to both Heathcliff and Catherine. Like, there was depth. That's something that I would argue for, that these characters were not superficial, that there was a lot of depth to both Catherine and Heathcliff, even though, again, not a fan of either one. But there was depth, and that's why I would kind of not agree with that bit. But the rest of it, I 100% do agree with, because the back and forth between Nellie narrating and the present, the past, like, there's a lot going on. And there was a second opinion, a 1 star review by Madeline, who said that, now this one was, this one was really funny. I cannot for the life of me understand why anyone thinks this is a love story. It is a horror story of love and passion gone horribly, horribly wrong. She continued, Edward Cullen is good, but Heathcliff wrote the beep book on domestic abuse thinly disguised as love. I think I loved this review because I think it was so blunt and it kind of, again, I agree with elements of it that this is not your conventional love story. Like, this is not your conventional love story. This, I wouldn't even call this a romance story. And we are going to talk about it. That's the next thing we're going to get to, whether or not this is a love story, whether or not this is romance. But I do see what Madeline means. And the link back to Edmund Cullen is great because I haven't read the books though, to be very fair. I haven't read the books. I have only watched one and a half of the movies. I'm not a fan, but I can sort of see what they're talking about. And I definitely do think there is that element of, the domestic abuse thinly disguised as love. Maybe not as much between Heathcliff. Catherine, actually, Catherine does play that card and she gaslights Edgar so much. She gaslights Edgar, poor Edgar. Like, if there's one character you feel bad for, two, it's Edgar and Isabella. Like, they're both abused by Heathcliff and Catherine. But so, yeah, so I do agree with it in a sense, I guess. So that's essentially what people are saying. Like I said, I'll pop up the links so that you can have a look if you would like to further see what everyone is saying. Now, this brings me to what are critics saying? What's the chatter amongst, like, obviously, we've gone ahead, we've read the book and we have these opinions, but we're not literary critics. Like, I'm not a critic. I've written English essays for my HSC, but I'm not a critic in any sense. So what I wanted to then do, and that's kind of the foundation of this podcast, is not just to sort of talk about what I think, because, well, obviously it's important to critically think about the books you're reading. Like, I also want to challenge my ideas and opinions by looking at what other people are saying. And who better than someone who's actually studied the book in a lot more depth, in a lot more technical depth than I have. So let's have a look at what critics are saying. Now, there are two things that I kind of want to focus on. There are two big questions, I would call them. Now, the first question is whether or not Wuthering Heights is a love story. We've seen in the reviews as well, all the reviews are grounded on the fact that this relationship between Heathcliff and Catherine was very problematic, but at the same time, it was very compelling. That's how I would describe it. So that's what I wanted to research. And the second question that I've got for you is, who is the villain in Wuthering Heights? So we'll talk about that, and then we'll finish off by looking at what the general opinion about Wuthering Heights is, in the scholarly circle. So let's start off by looking at whether or not this is a love story. Now, this is a really interesting question, and I found a really good paper on this. So like I said, I'll pop up the link for the paper. Now, this paper was written by James Phillips, and in his paper, and it's called The Two Faces of Love in Wuthering Heights. So, Phillips is arguing that indeed Wuthering Heights is a love story. So he argues that, yep, Wuthering Heights is a love story, and that is because Catherine has two loves. Now, this is the idea that I need you to stick with me on and just understand because it's kind of a bit complicated. Essentially, his thesis is that Catherine had two loves. Her first love was this empirical love that she had for Edgar. So that's the portrayal of an empirical love because that depended on his wealth and how he looked. Whereas Catherine's second love was for Heathcliff, and that love was more transcendental. Like, it was more transcendental because it was necessary. This is a really interesting thesis, I think, because there's so much going on here. So he's basically saying that Bronte has broken down love into two parts, into this empirical love that is dependent and contingent on Edgar's looks and his wealth and his, financial security. Whereas the second love that she portrays is that transcendental nature of love between Heathcliff and Catherine that is more pure, that is necessary almost to both of their survival. And we see that at the end as well. So I think it's really interesting. And we see it in the book. And I do think, I'm not sure if that's what Emily was trying to portray. Now, what Phillips has used as his evidence is the quote in the book that when Catherine says, my love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. My love for Edgar Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it. And then she goes on and she says, my love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of light, visible delight, but necessary. This idea that Edgar's love, like her love for Edgar, is contingent on all of these things that he has to offer, whereas Heathcliff has nothing to offer, but his love resembles the eternal rocks beneath the foundation of life in a way, of their lives. So I think that was really interesting. So my argument here though is that like I said, I think it's a very interesting thesis and I can definitely see the foundation for it in the books. But my argument here would be that I'm not sure if I would say that Catherine loved Edgar. Like, I get what Phillips is trying to say by portraying that idea of an empirical love, but at the same time, I feel like I wouldn't even classify it as love. Now, this could be because of all of our own individual understandings of love, of what it means to love, of what it means to be loved. But I would say to me, Catherine's love, like it wasn't love. Maybe it was she cared for him, absolutely, but it wasn't love. Like she gaslit him so much, even after they get married. Whereas I would say on the other hand, Edgar's love for Catherine is real. Like he cares for her. He goes ahead and he does all these things, even though it upsets him, he does it for her. Whereas we don't see that with Catherine. So I'm not sure if I would classify that as love, but I can definitely see that there's definitely an argument to be made here. That's how I look at it. On the other hand, we see again that Heathcliff and Catherine, they're more different. I definitely do agree with that transcendental nature of their love because you see it. You see it in the books where it's like they truly find peace at the end of the book when they both die. Sorry if that was a spoiler, but they do. And so that's something that I think is really interesting because I can definitely see that. I think that I would classify that as love, but I'm not sure if I would classify Catherine and Catherine's love for Edgar as love in itself. So that's where I would sort of say that, yeah, like I get it. I get that argument to some point. Now, Phillips goes on to further argue that Wuthering Heights is an analysis of love in itself and that Bronte goes to these extremes to show and exhibit the components of love. And I think that's interesting. I do think that's interesting because if you think about it, Bronte's kind of showing the ugliness of love. That's how I see it. Like she's showing this ugliness of love by showing Catherine and Heathcliff's relationship, like by showing how messed up it is, but at the same time, how necessary it was for both of them. And in getting to that position, or in finding each other, they've ruined the lives of so many people, including their own kids in the process. So I think that's really, really interesting. And it does warrant for a really good argument. Now, that was Philip's argument. I've, again, summed it up. It was a great paper. If you want to read it, there'll be a link below if you want to go check it out. Now, there are many other people out there who, like we saw on Goodreads as well, who would disagree with this or this entire idea of Wuthering Heights being a love story or even the romance sort of being love to some extent. Now, one argument that I personally found pretty compelling was made in this Guardian article. So there was this opinion piece by Martin Kettle, and the title of this I think was great. It's called "If Wuthering Heights is a Love Story, Hamlet is a Sitcom." So creative. Now, fundamentally, Martin here is arguing that by classifying Wuthering Heights as a mere romance novel, we are trying to confine it and rearrange it and simplify the novel into categories, trying to simplify something that is complex. And I actually really like that argument because I do agree with it because, like I said, I think Emily Bronte's novel portrays that ugliness of all of these emotions. Like it's not as simple as, oh, they loved each other and they lived happily ever after. It's showing that it's so complex and it can't just simply be described in one word. And further, Martin Kettle goes on to quote, and he puts this quite nicely. He says, the novel is about many things rather than simply Catherine and Heathcliff's relationship. It's about class conflict, Heathcliff's obsession with revenge. It's about power and wealth and obsession and death. And I think that puts it really nicely because in our fixation with Catherine and Heathcliff's love story, which of course is the foundation of the book, we kind of miss interacting with the ideas of, class. We miss interacting with the ideas of how power and wealth has played into this notion. And it's ironic because, in my opinion, that those ideas of power and wealth are actually the foundation of what's happened between Catherine and Heathcliff. Because, that's the motivation, that's the root cause of all these events that take over. Because remember, Catherine ultimately chooses Edgar over Heathcliff because she knows that she will have that financial security with Edgar that she won't have with Heathcliff. And on the other hand, that's why she wants to marry rich. Whereas Heathcliff ultimately goes away for 3 years, and because he is ashamed in a way by what Catherine thinks of him and his lack of status. And he comes back and he's rich and he's wealthy and he wants these properties as a way of revenge. So that revenge and that motivation in one way is tied very strongly to power and wealth. So I think that was really, really interesting. And that's what I love about this book is that, you pick apart one thread and you kind of see this whole plethora of ideas begin to unfold and you actually get to understand what a masterpiece Bronte has written. Like, it's not this simplistic story that we are trying to make it. It's a very deep level analysis of love and of class and of power. Now, talking about power brings us to my second question. Now, this question, I think I'm kind of more excited to talk about this than the first one because this was one of those things, like, even though I had been thinking about, the idea of love in Wuthering Heights, the second question I hadn't really considered. Who is the villain in Wuthering Heights? Who is the darkest character? Now, my first opinion, like my first answer on that would have been Heathcliff. Like, surely, he is so evil. He is so detestable. Like, I hate him. You read the book and you're like, this guy just, if there was a punching bag, like, it's so annoying. However, in this paper, now I came across this paper when I first started putting this idea of the podcast together and, researching Wuthering Heights. Now, this paper by James Hafley is called The Villain in Wuthering Heights. And his thesis is that ultimately the biggest villain of Wuthering Heights is Nellie Dean, a narrator. So this is, when I first read this, I was like, whoa. And I've, read this on my iPad because I was annotating. I was like, whoa, what do you mean? Because, now here's the thing, because when I first read the book, the only character that I would have understood or I would have, sympathized with was Nellie. I finished the book and I was like, you know what? Nellie does not get paid enough to deal with the crap that she's dealt with 30 years. Like, girl just needs a break, and I was just like, she is like, the fact that 30 years, and I was like, finally in the book, and I was like, finally, she can have some peace, she can have some peace. But here's the thing that I hadn't really thought about. There were parts in the book now where, Nellie does stuff, where she lies, where she hides things. For example, she hides things from Edgar when little Kathy grows up. She purposefully, the biggest thing that she does is that she purposefully hides from Catherine when Heathcliff is listening at the door. When Catherine is confessing her love for Edgar and Heathcliff is listening at the door, and Nellie sees him, but she does not say anything. Right? So these little moments which I sort of annotated in my book, and I was like, Nellie, you shouldn't do that, or you should tell him, or whatever. But I kind of, left it at that. What I did not think about is the consequences of that. Like the fact that, remember now here also, that Nellie is a narrator. She is a narrator. And the reason I think she works so well as a narrator is because, to a huge extent, she confirms our own opinions about Heathcliff and Catherine. Like, she's telling this whole story to Lockwood. And at the same time, by doing that, she's telling the story. It's very subjective. So we actually don't know the people, Heathcliff and Catherine. We only know the portrayal that Nellie has shown. And that is so, so smartly done by Bronte. Can you imagine, like, it's right in front of your eyes, but you just don't see, or you don't think about it until you think about it. That Bronte has done that. She's given us this character and we don't actually think about the subjectiveness of what we are being told. We buy into that story. And that's often the argument to be made with a lot of third-person narration books. But coming back to this idea, the one-star review that I was talking about before by Madeline, who said that Cullen's, he's just the starting, whereas Heathcliff wrote the book on domestic abuse. Now, in her review, Madeline also mentioned that I like some of the characters. Ellen was sweet and seemed to be the only sensible person in the story. And Lord, does she get put through a lot of shit. Girlfriend needs a hug and a spa weekend after all she's been through. Now, I would 100% agree with Madeline. as soon as I read the book, like as that would have been the first thing I would have agreed with. I'm like, absolutely, Madeline, you're on the money. Ellen was just so good. She does need time away from all the crap that she's been put through. But the reason we all like Nellie, the reason we call her Ellen is because her full name is Ellen Dean, but in the book she's known as Nellie. Sorry if I should have confirmed that earlier, but hopefully we weren't too confused. So the reason we trust Nellie as a narrator is because she confirms our thoughts. She thinks, like, when you read the story of Catherine and Heathcliff, you're like, what idiots. Like, these people are not good. And that's exactly what Nellie is thinking. That's exactly what Nellie is telling us. Again, I'm not sure if it's because, like, it's a purposeful thing where this is very murky, right? Because it's like, if it's on purpose, she portrays them this way. But we see this story through Nellie's eyes. And by doing that, Nellie becomes our eyes. And we form this very authentic connection with Nellie. That's how I found it. I was like, okay, Nellie is confirming my opinions. When I think they're stupid, Nellie thinks they're stupid, right? Because there's a description between her saying, oh, this is what happened. And then she says, this is what I thought about it. And that part of where she says, this is what I thought about, that's what I was thinking about when I was reading it. I'm like, okay, finally, someone sees sense. So I do think there's like a way in which our own ego as readers plays into this whole thing. But coming back to a point is that Nellie's not the simple character that she seems at first glance. And I think Bronte has done that so well. So here's the thing, right? So this is what Hafley says in his paper. He is saying that Ellen Dean is the villain of the piece, one of the consummate villains in English literature. And this blew me away because I was like, what do you mean? Like, I literally have annotations on my book where I'm like, oh, Nellie, but why are you lying? Or why are you not telling the truth to protect yourself? Like, that did not feel right. But I kind of ignored that until I read this paper and I started to think about all the things that she's done, the little things that have, in a way, perpetuated the bigger things that have happened in the novel, right? So, yeah, like I said, we all know that, Nellie is a character who is loved, even Charlotte Bronte. Now, and I wasn't going to talk too much about Jane Eyre or, Charlotte Bronte, but, and this was in Hafley's paper, even Charlotte Bronte was quoted saying that Nellie is a specimen of benevolence and homely fidelity. So I think Nellie tricks us all. And that's the way, and I do think definitely that Emily Bronte was smart enough to make Nellie seem so, to make her seem like a very simple character on the surface, but actually to be very manipulative and power hungry, in reality, because ultimately at the end of the day, she ends up, remember, she's a servant at the Earnshaw. She's the servant in the past at Wuthering Heights. But she assumes this position of authority by playing the middleman between Catherine and Heathcliff. She is in a position of authority when she's telling Lockwood what has happened. So many critics, again, see Nellie as a very shrewd but normal character, and Hafley sort of goes through that in his paper. But what he argues is that she was the villain in this whole novel. Now, one thing that he does say that I don't agree with is that he says if Nellie inconvenienced Lockwood slightly, she has inconvenienced Heathcliff to the point of tragedy. Now, this is after like a quote that Lockwood says about being inconvenienced. Now, this is really interesting, but I do think to some extent that, it would be wrong to justify Heathcliff's behavior by using Nellie as like a scapegoat for his behavior and blaming his behavior on her. And the weird thing is, as soon as I wrote that down, my own argument kind of fell apart because guess what? Everything we know about Heathcliff is through Nellie's eyes. So the way in which he's described is that he's just this dark person. Like, he is not a good person. He's had stuff happen to him. He wants revenge, and it's understandable. He's been abused by Hindley, but at the same time, Nellie says that he's not a kind person. He's not a person of his experiences as such. He was pretty bad before that. And that's really interesting because that's the information that we have from Nellie. We don't know if that's true. So I think it's really interesting. But like going off the information that we do have, I'm not sure if I would fully say that Nellie is responsible for the things that Heathcliff has done. I don't think that is 100% true, but I can definitely see the argument for Nellie being the villain. I can see that argument. So I'm going to summarize what Halfley had to say about this whole thing. So his argument was that if she told Catherine that Heathcliff was listening during the confession, if she was listening during the confession, their whole tragedy wouldn't have unfolded. Catherine would know Heathcliff's there. Heathcliff, wouldn't have just heard that first part and left. Is that how it would have happened? I don't know. Only Emily Bronte would know, but that's this argument. And that argument was written by V.S. Pritchard, who is quoted by Halfley. So just to be careful there. Now, the second thing that Halfley says is that, or that he argues for, is that Nellie enjoyed her power, right? So she enjoyed being in that position of authority. She was the housemaid. And remember, after Catherine the First, after the first Catherine dies and Nellie's left in charge of little Cathy and she's living in Thrushcross Grange, she becomes a very powerful figure in the house. She almost takes over the mistress role to some extent. She's raising little Cathy. She has all this role. At one point, she refers to one of the other servants and the servant came up. And we sort of see the voice of authority that she takes on, which shows that she was power hungry. And at the same time, she also compares herself to the Earnshaws. And she sees herself as like part of the Earnshaws, being a part of the Earnshaws, which is really interesting because she wasn't an Earnshaw, but she sort of, and in one of the bits she says that, I was friends with Hindley. Hindley and I were almost like brother and sister. That's really interesting because that's not true. She was a servant. But at the same time, she comes into this position of authority and I do think she abuses it. A lot of the times things happen. For example, when little Cathy goes off and she runs off to Wuthering Heights and Ellen does not tell that to Edgar. Ellen knows that it's not safe for little Cathy, that the one person little Cathy shouldn't be going near is Heathcliff. But Nellie, in order to save herself, in order to save her back, does not tell Edgar that. And that was one of the things that annoyed more than the others, is that what she does. And another thing that I really liked about Halfley's paper is the evidence he gave. The little minute stuff that you would have read in the books and just thought, there's not much to think about there. So, for example, he refers back to the scene in the book where Nellie allows Catherine to grin and spit on Heathcliff. And this is when like Heathcliff has first come, right? He's just come and they're not friends. And she allows Hindley and Catherine to kind of mistreat Heathcliff. And she also isolates Heathcliff. Something happens, she sends Heathcliff to sort of, be by himself in like the top floor or something. So she perpetuates his villainy in a way, I think by like not calling out Hindley and Catherine, she perpetuates Heathcliff's villainy. She perpetuates and gives him the motivation for vengeance against Hindley. And at the beginning, Catherine as well, but ultimately it's Hindley. So that is really interesting. I do think that if there was an argument to be made against that point, it could be that at that time, Nellie was pretty young herself. Like she isn't too much older than Hindley and Catherine. So she was pretty young when she does do that, when she does isolate Heathcliff. That argument could also be made that she was also kind of a kid herself. But anyways, there was another scene in which, and again, I missed this as well. I don't think I thought about it much in the book. So this is where Hindley hits Heathcliff with an iron weight. And what Nellie does is that Nellie again goes ahead and she covers for Hindley and she says, I persuaded him to easily let me lay the blame on the bruises on the horse. So she persuades Heathcliff to easily let me lay the blame of the bruises on the horse. So covering for Hindley, she kind of perpetuates that villainy that Heathcliff feels. She isolates him as well. So there is another really interesting bit that we see in the book. So this is the last bit that I'll be talking about from the paper. Now, the paper was really good. If you want to go ahead and read it, please do that. I think it was awesome. But the last little bit that I found really interesting, and again, I do think I probably missed this as well in my first reading of the book, because I always think like the first reading is always really good to just get a gist of the story. Maybe when I go back now to read, I'll look at it in a different way. And that's the beauty of reading, right? Like when you read it the second time, you get all these ideas that you didn't have the first time. But anyways, this is what Nellie tells Heathcliff. Were I in your place, I would frame high notions of my birth and the thoughts of what I should give me courage and dignity to support the oppressions of a little farmer. What Hafley is arguing for here is that Nellie has built a romantic dream for herself, but she's unable to realize it. So she's, telling Heathcliff that were I in your place, I would frame high notions of my birth. So she wants that power. She wants to not be in the position that she is. And to a huge extent, to maintain that power, she does things in her own interest. I think that's the best way for me to summarize it. She does things in her own interest. She does things that she thinks are right. And it's really interesting because that is how Emily Bronte has employed like this amazing language and this complex style that once you see through it, you actually see the motivation of, Nellie as the narrator. And that's thanks to Bronte's narration style. So that brings us back to what Emily Bronte has done. And to finish off with that, I want to talk about what overall critics have said about Bronte's work. So this is from a paper written by Melvin R. Watson, and this is basically looking at all the criticism that Wuthering Heights has received. That's called Wuthering Heights and the Critics. So basically, the criticism for Bronte's work ranges from things like forcible writing to powerful and original, or to like awkwardly and illogically constructed. I think the last bit about illogically constructed kind of falls apart now that we've talked about how that narration that she has used, it's very smart. It's very, very smart, and it's done very well. And like I said, a lot of the criticism also speaks back to the comparison with Charlotte's Jane Eyre. And another interesting comparison that is made to like other literary works is that Heathcliff is compared to Hamlet. Like he's been called the biggest villain in literature since Hamlet, which is, again, very interesting. I would probably rate Heathcliff higher than Hamlet. But then again, I haven't read Hamlet. Like I know what happens, but I haven't actually read it. So maybe I'm not the most equipped to comment on it yet. So the paper's basically like looking at what critics have said since the book was published to, more contemporary critics. Now, there was one critic in The Spectator, which I probably think is a literary magazine, who says that the success of the book is not equal to the abilities of the writer because the incident and the persons are too coarse and disagreeable. So they're basically saying that these characters are not agreeable. And that's true. They're very detestable. But again, I think that is the beauty of Bronte's writing. Because and that relates to another criticism that she gets, is that Wuthering Heights does not adhere to the Victorian standards of writing, to the Victorian style of writing. And I think that is so interesting because what Emily has done is by subverting these Victorian standards, she has created a masterpiece and her writing is beautiful. So while, yes, her characters are disagreeable, I think that's where the power of her writing lies, is because even though you hate these characters, you get emotionally invested in them. You do care about what happens. You don't care about the characters, but you care about what happens. And I think that's really powerful. And that's Emily's legacy as well. There's no reason this book would have endured 177 years if it wasn't for this powerful writing. And that's the thing, right? With a lot of these pieces of work, they don't get the recognition that they should at the time it was published. Like Emily Bronte did not know the masterpiece she'd written and the legend that she would go on to become. So, and that's so unfortunate because the work that she's done is going to go on to achieve what it has. That's sad. Like it's so brilliant what she's done, and not to have the recognition for it is very sad. So yeah, so the book has been called a lot of things, from a repellent book, someone actually called it repellent, to the fact that it should be called Wuthering Heights. And the argument for that is because it shrinks your mind and your body. It's a creative argument, like it's a creative criticism, but it's a bit mean, and I don't think it shrinks your mind and body at all. I do think actually it's the opposite, right? Because when you look at what she's trying to say, you actually realize that there is so much going on that you kind of have to put your brain to it to kind of get through it all. Another compliment actually that is offered by W. Kinsley, he goes, "The book, despite all its imperfections, serves to body forth the superb soul of Emily Bronte." And I think that is So now remember, I don't know Emily Bronte. No one knew Emily Bronte as such, right? Other than her family. Like from my research, she was known to be a enigmatic person, and pretty reserved. So, we can't really know what was at her soul. But I do, like, from what I've heard, is that she was very preoccupied with showing passion and emotion and showing the complexity of it. And if that was truly what was at her heart, I think she's achieved that so well with this book that is Wuthering Heights. So, my friends, that brings us to an end of today's episode. There was a lot that we went through today. Firstly, I hope that you enjoyed what we talked about today. There are a lot of ideas, and I think it's really interesting because it makes you think so deeply about a work that often is, like Martin Kettle said in his article, that is often sort of confined to boxes that we know, and we don't really get to understand and to see the complexity that is ebbing and flowing underneath all of that. So I think that's very interesting. I really enjoyed this. I had a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoyed listening. So all in all, I would say that Wuthering Heights, it's definitely one of those books that even if you hate the characters, you're not fond of the characters, you're not fond of what's happening, the things that they do. The one thing that I think makes it such a recipe for success is the writing. It is so, so well written. And that's the reason I would rate it a 5 star. So ultimately, if you love a complex story, if you love dark characters, this book is for you. I would highly recommend it. And with that, I am going to finish off with today's episode. I will see you again next week with a new episode. And next week, we will be looking at The Secret History by Donna Tartt. There's so much to talk about with this one as well. So I'm really excited to get into that. In the meanwhile, please subscribe to my Substack. You can find me on Instagram at AK's Bookish Haven. And you can also find this podcast wherever you get your podcast from, Apple or Spotify, and of course on Substack as well. Please hit the subscribe button so that you're updated. And I will also be posting like written reviews of the things that I read and then obviously talking about in this podcast. But I'm really excited to get started, and I hope you can join me on this journey. So thank you for listening, bookworms. Have an amazing, amazing week. Happy reading, and I will see you next week with a new episode.